Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I wanted to introduce you to one of the more successful greasy grace grifters out here on YouTube. I'm talking about a goddamned false teacher, and I mean quite literally goddamned. I don't use that term lightly. I mean someone who is on his way to hell. This is a goddamn false teacher who calls himself Onorato Diamante and claims to be based out of Rhode Island. Well, in the last 3 years, Onorato has done quite well for himself out here on YouTube. And unless he's independently wealthy and has purchased a lot of subscribers, he has gathered in the last 3 years some 35,000 subscribers, all with itching ears who love his greasy grace doctrine, the gospel according to personal sacrifice free, easy believism. And this young man has become quite skilled at peddling this lie from hell. Every day, it seems, he has a 10-minute video explaining to you how you can get your easy pass to heaven, your admit one through the pearly gates, despite never having picked up your cross and traveled that long and hard road that leads to life. That is not a requirement in this gospel. So tonight, I wanted to introduce you to this fellow so you can mark and avoid him like you do the other tear-sowing false prophets who are all over YouTube. If you've watched this channel, you know who I'm talking about. Well, those absolute saboteurs pale in comparison to the damage this wicked young man is out here doing. So I'm going to go through one video where he covers in 10 minutes quite a lot of territory, puts out an enormous amount of misinformation in just 10 minutes. I wanted to go through some of it with you, debunk it, and again, furnish you with a warning about this character. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so this charming mug here belongs to the aforementioned Onorato Diamante, the greasy grace grifter, who has done quite well for himself out here on YouTube. 35,000 subscribers. And who knows, maybe even 5,000 of them are real. I don't know. Anyway, he's out here just about every day. I see in the last 3 years, he has produced some 765 mini sermons, each one more perverse, more misleading than the last. And let's see, when was this one from? I picked this one out. I've seen about a dozen so far in the last couple of days. It just struck me how successful compared to Jack Smack and Praise I Am and the Layman Seminary, you know, some of the usual suspects I've been discussing on this channel. But this fellow here has left them all in the dust. I'm looking here. He's got, let's see, yes, 35K subscribers, supposedly, Onorato. Now, let's see, when was this video here made? This 1 year ago. Okay, 1 year ago, he's going to tell us that men in the Old Testament were saved by faith. Now, he's not going to tell you what the faith was in. He's going to tell you they were saved by faith, just by their right think. They didn't do anything. All they did was think the right warm and fuzzies about God, and they went to heaven, just like you can. You don't have to do anything. You just have to do right thing, according to Onorato. Now, as best I could tell, Onorato has no credentials in any relevant subject. He doesn't hold a degree in Bible, theology, divinity. As far as I know, he's never been ordained by anybody. And of course, he's never been spirit baptized. I doubt he's even witnessed anyone being spirit baptized. So he's got no academic, ministerial, or spiritual credentials. And I seriously doubt he even belongs to a church because I haven't heard him mention one. I doubt he has any partners at all in ministry. And he's out here collecting money on YouTube for his own purposes. He's not raising money for missions somewhere. He's his own mission. But he's out here again trying to tell you how you can get through the pearly gates without ever having to be a Christian, because that would be a work. And we all know we're not saved by works. We're saved by our thought life, according to these greasy grace grifters. All right. So let's go through this 10-minute long, absolutely perverse mini sermon. And I'm going to tear it to pieces. And at the end of it, I'm going to suggest that you remember this face and this name, and you mark and avoid both. Let's take a listen.
Always been and will always be by grace through faith alone. Unfortunately, proponents of dispensational salvation have led many to believe that in the Old Testament, man was saved through a combination of both faith and works. First and foremost, if salvation was in fact by works in the Old Testament, then undoubtedly those who lived under the law would have a basis to boast before God. Don't miss that. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 says, "For by grace are ye saved through faith."
Once again, the favorite spurious proof text of the greasy grace grifter is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. You'll get to 9 in a moment here. This, contrary to popular public opinion, is not about eternal salvation. Sorry, but Ephesians chapter 2 is about this life, not the next. In fact, nowhere in Ephesians, the entire letter to the Ephesians, are we discussing heaven and hell. Just doesn't come up. It says here, "For by grace are ye saved through faith." And again, anytime you see somebody using the Calvin-retarded old King James version of the Bible, you can be certain they have never studied the scriptures outside of their own mini cult somewhere. No New Testament scholar uses the King James version. Okay, for the same reason you're not running Windows 95 and getting your email from AOL anymore. Okay, a New Testament scholar will use the New American Standard Bible because it has a functional equivalent to the original language. It's not a paraphrase. Nobody uses the King James version who's a genuine scholar. But of course, we're talking about a YouTube grifter here, okay? And he goes, "For by grace are ye saved through faith." Fine. Once again, this word that gets translated faith, pisteos, this is a noun. It's not a verb. It is a noun that describes the fidelity of the Son of God to God the Father. It's not a verb that describes the warm and fuzzy thought life of the Ephesians, which the Apostle Paul could not possibly have known. Okay? He's saying by grace, you are saved from paganism, from your estrangement from God. You can't eisegete from hell after saved. Not here, not in Titus 3:5, not in Acts 4:12, and several other places where you see that misleading verb saved. Sorry, don't add from hell like this false teacher just did. For by grace you are saved from the context. And in this context, it's talking about estrangement from God. This may have implications for the afterlife, but it's not discussing the afterlife. For by grace you've been saved from paganism through the faithfulness of the Son of God. It is the gift of God. Let's go into verse 9 here.
"And that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works," watch this, "lest any man should boast."
Yeah, not of works. And what does works mean to an ex-Pharisee like Paul? Somebody who made his living in the temple? You think it means helping little old ladies through intersections? No. Works are things like circumcision, things like honoring the Passover, things like bringing a bull to the temple to be slaughtered on Yom Kippur. These are the works that he's talking about when an ex-Pharisee is talking about. He's not talking about any and every conceivable visible thing you do in an effort to please God. If that's what he meant, Romans chapter 2, verses 6 through 11 would make 0 sense. So would Philippians 2:12, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Okay, so he's not contradicting himself. He's talking about works prescribed by the Torah. But this pious ignoramus doesn't know that and wouldn't care. If Paul himself explained that he's not talking about any and every visible action you do in an effort to please God, Diamante would sit Paul down and try to explain to him what Ephesians 2:9 actually means. When you're dealing with a religious drunk, okay, and that's what we're dealing with here out here, false teachers who are on a religious drunk. He was probably on a different kind of drunk when he was much younger. Now he's on a religious drunk. You can't tell him anything. I'm not talking to him. I'm talking to you. Let's move on.
Romans chapter 3, verse 27 says, where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith.
The law of faith, again, faith is a noun. It denotes fidelity. Unless you see the content of the belief, that noun denotes faithfulness. But of course, the Calvitarded and Lutholatrous translators of this left it deliberately ambiguous so that easy believers like our friend here could pretend that Paul is talking about your thought life instead of your fidelity to the Son of God. You know what? Paul didn't need faith. He knew the truth. He didn't need to trust in anything. He'd seen the risen Christ. And the people he was writing to, they knew the truth. They didn't need to trust that the gospel was true. They knew it was true. They didn't need faith to stay faithful to Christ because pretty soon they were going to light up the Roman sky as torches. When Nero used them to light up the Roman sky, he blamed the great fire on Christians just a few years after this letter was written. This is the sort of faith that Paul is talking about, the faith to maintain allegiance to King Jesus despite the persecution. It's not about suspending disbelief. And the law here, the deeds of the law, of course, are the deeds of the Torah, the deeds that Paul was expert in. Remember, he's an ex-Pharisee who persecuted Christians because they were breaking the law of Moses. They were blaspheming the law of Moses. So when he talks about the law, again, the law is not a synonym for the will of God or the golden rule. The law is shorthand for the law of Moses. But this goddamn pious fraud does not know that and does not care. And he's out here every day running other pious ignorami totally amok with his own ignorance. Continuing.
Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified how? By faith without the deeds of the law.
Yeah, he's justified by faith to King Jesus. Fidelity to King Jesus. That's what he's talking about here. That is what he is contrasting the law of Moses with. He's telling these people we're no longer doing obedience, doing faith toward the law of Moses. We're doing it to the Messiah. That's the difference. This fool doesn't get it. He's pretending the law is some synonym, again, for the golden rule. The law means do unto others as you do unto you like them to do to you. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about the law of Moses, which contained specific provisions for atoning for sin. And Paul is saying we're not doing those specific provisions to atone for our sin anymore. We're not doing the guilt offerings. Okay? We're not doing peace offerings, free will offerings. No. We're not under that law anymore. What makes us righteous is our fidelity to King Jesus. This fool does not understand that and doesn't want to, because if he did, it would cancel his easy pass to heaven. It would involve a genuine commitment, and that is not something this pious fraud wants anything to do with. Continuing.
It is imperative to realize that grace and works are mutually exclusive, meaning if salvation was by works, then it could not have been by grace. And if salvation was by grace, then it could not have been by works. It's either
wrong, false teacher. The grace is the opportunity to become righteous through fidelity to your Savior. That is the grace. That was not something God had to do. He gracefully gave you the opportunity to get right with him, not by obeying the works of the Torah, but by staying true to his sinless son. That's how we get right. So again, he doesn't understand the most basic of terms and doesn't want to. Let's continue.
either by grace or by works, but it cannot be by both. I'll say that again. It's either by grace or by works, but it cannot be by both.
Wrong, because even you're saying it's your own work. You're claiming it's your own belief. It's your own trust. It's something you do. The difference is your works, what you do, cost you exactly zippity doo-dah. And that's how we know you are a goddamned false teacher. Okay? You're trying to sell somebody an easy pass to heaven, and you're full of crap. And you're going to hell for that too. You think I'm joking? You, sir, are going to be judged for this false teaching. And barring a miracle that would cause the blessed apostles' jaw to hit the floor, you've got an unbreakable date with the lake of fire. You're out here, you've already got God knows how much blood on your hands for all your false teaching. And you're going to be out here for the next, I don't know how long, doing the same thing every day, day after day. My friend, you are going to one of the lowest parts of hell, and deservedly so. God have mercy.
Romans chapter 11, verse 6 says, and if by grace, then is it no more of works. Why? Otherwise, grace.
No, you're yanking Romans 11:6 out of its context, okay? It's not talking about individuals in the first place. It's talking about the remnant that have bowed the knee to Jesus. And again, the works are the works of the law, the works of the law of Moses, staying faithful to that law. That's what he's saying. It's not of being faithful to the law of Moses. By grace, you have the opportunity to bow your knee to Jesus. That's what he's talking about in Romans 11:6, and he's talking about a significant remnant of the nation of Israel. He's not talking about individuals in Romans 11:6. You have no right to co-opt this verse and shoehorn it into your imaginary, oh so convenient soteriology. No, that is eisegesis. That is a totally undisciplined hermeneutic. And no one who had been formally trained and suggested such a thing, if I was to suggest such a thing to my seminary professor in the paper, I'd get lines through it. No, you can't do that. That's not normative hermeneutics. That's eisegesis. You've yanked it out of context and you're putting your own warm and fuzzy ideas into the text. Wrong.
grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Why? Otherwise, work is no more work. Many mistakenly identify the law as a means of justification rather than a mirror which reflects man's sinful condition.
Idiot. The law was the means of justification before Christ. That's why it was given. That's how they got just. That's why they had a law of Moses. That's why they had a temple cult. That's why they had a priesthood. They got right with God every year by following the law. Now, when Jesus comes, the law is obsolete. It has been superseded. It is no longer obedience to the law that makes you just. It is self-sacrificial obedience to King Jesus. Your fidelity to him is what allows you to stand in his righteousness on Judgment Day. Romans 3:26. Okay? God is justifying those with the faithfulness of Jesus, not faith in Jesus. He doesn't get it and doesn't want to.
And inability to save himself. Those who would propose that man at any time could be justified by keeping the law do not understand the law's demand of perfection and its purpose.
No, idiot. The law never demanded perfection. If it did, the law of Moses would not contain terms like sin offering, guilt offering, free will offering, peace offering. Did you ever actually read the law of Moses? That's how they got right with God. Okay? And why, if God expects somebody to be perfect, why does he put provisions in the law of Moses that allow you to atone for sin? So you're totally full of crap. You have no idea what you're talking about, and you don't care.
Specific to salvation. In other words, if the law must be kept at all, then all the law must be kept. James chapter 2, verse 10 says, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point," watch this, "he is guilty of all." Galatians chapter 3, verse 10 says, "For as..."
All right, hold on. Let's get a copy of James 2:10, and let's look at it in the context, and let's put the lie to this false teacher here. Put this down here. Okay, so I pulled out my own file here on James 2:10, and I'm just going to read from it. It is not that long. No need to share it with you here on the screen. But I'm going to read what I've written about this particular verse, which easy believists are constantly throwing us in our face to create this false dilemma that we either have to be completely sinlessly perfect, or we have to follow or we can simply believe the gospel. This is the false dilemma that they're always trying to present us with. We either simply believe, or we have to be sinlessly perfect, and we know that because James 2:10 tells us. Wrong. If you read the entire chapter, or better still, the entire letter, you will clearly see James was not telling his fellow Jewish Christians they need to despise the law of Moses if they want to get to heaven. On the contrary, James cites the Old Testament all over his letter to make his several points. For example, in chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, it talks about Abraham and Rahab, as well he should. And his letter is addressed to Jews. So, of course, he's going to use the Old Testament and talk about things like the law. All right. In context, in James chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, he reminds them that the way they are showing partiality to the rich is a violation of Leviticus 19, verse 15b. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. That's what he's talking about. You can't be partial. That's the subject of James chapter 2. It's not a, James chapter 2 is not talking about how to get to heaven. Okay. It's not telling you this is, but this is our soteriology chapter. And we're going to tell you how you have to despise the law of Moses and simply believe the gospel to get to heaven. That's not what he's doing in chapter 2. He's complaining that these brothers are showing partiality to the rich. Okay? You can't do that. He encourages them to keep the law by saying in chapter 2, verse 8, if you really want to fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus 19:18. You do well. But then James is quick to add in verse 9, but if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law. The law he just mentioned, Leviticus 19:15. You can't show partiality to the rich. Okay. Again, if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Then in chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, he reminds them that no one who obeys some of the laws, but not others, can fairly be said to be keeping the royal law, quoted in Matthew 22:39 by Jesus himself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the royal law, okay? So he's saying, if you're showing partiality to the rich, you're not loving your neighbor as yourself. All right, so moving it down here. James in 2:12 urges, so speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. Okay, and 2:12 is referring to what he said earlier in chapter 1, verse 25, essentially that the law of Moses must be understood and obeyed by the law given in the gospel of Jesus the Christ. Jesus reminds them of the law of liberty. He's alluding to 125, James 125, and the parable of the unforgiving master in Matthew 18:23-35. Interestingly, it shows he was familiar with the gospel according to Matthew. In 2:13, James 2:13, he reminds them of the take-home message of that parable in Matthew. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. That's the law of liberty in James. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Okay, so James in 2:10 is not saying anyone trying to go to heaven by doing good deeds must never, ever, ever sin. That's not what he's saying. He's saying simply no one can honor God and his law by loving their neighbor as they love themselves if at the same time they're showing partiality to the rich. So doing that is ignoring God's law and becoming an offender of it. That's all he's saying. He's saying you're not keeping the law if you're also showing partiality to the rich. He's not talking about you have a choice between believing something or being perfectly sinless. That's not what James 2:10, and yet these easy believers are constantly yanking this passage, that little snippet from James, always yanking it out of its context and forcing it into service as a spurious proof text to confront you with this false dilemma: sinless perfection or belief in the gospel. That is another lie from hell. Study the chapter yourself. You'll see it's not a discussion about eternal salvation. All right. Let me get back to our friend here, if I can. I need to calm down here, don't I? I think my blood pressure is going up listening to this guy. All right. Continuing along here. Now he's on Galatians 3:10. For as many as us, as many as are of the works of the law, I can't even see it here. Let me move it down. Are under the curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth. All right, let's let him speak and hang himself.
Many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. Why? For it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in some things. No, that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them.
Okay, so once again, he's trying to confront us with a false dilemma here. Either be perfectly sinless or believe the gospel. That's what he's trying to tell you that Galatians 3:10 is saying. Look it up. That's not what he's saying here. Okay. In fact, what he's been saying in Galatians, this is addressing the Judaizers there, who were saying that the believers that church needed to become circumcised and start doing some of the things that were in the law of Moses. And here Paul is saying, yes, if you are going to do some of the things that are in the law of Moses, or if you feel compelled to do them, the commands of the book of the law of Moses, you're also going to have to do your own sacrifices for sin. And there are numerous provisions in the Torah for atoning for sin. And Paul is trying to tell this church at Galatia that once you feel compelled to do certain things within the law of Moses, like circumcision, okay, maybe like going to the temple on the holy days or something like that. If you start doing some of that, then you're going to have to do the rest of it too. And that includes atoning for your own sins, bringing your own animal sacrifices. And if you do that, then the sacrifice of the cross does not apply to you. You're still under the law. Now you can get right with God under the law, but you have to do all of the law, including those temple sacrifices. That's what Paul is saying here. He doesn't get that, doesn't care.
Galatians chapter 5, verse 3 says, "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law."
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. If you're going to get the circumcision, you're also going to have to do the temple sacrifices. You're also going to have to keep the Passover, the festival of booths, circumcise your baby boy on the 8th day, bring your bull to the temple on Yom Kippur. You're going to have to do the whole 9 yards, is what he's saying. So the Judaizers had infiltrated the church at Galatia, and they were telling the Christians there that there were some certain things within the law of Moses that they were obliged to do. Paul is saying, no, you're not obliged to do these things. And if you feel obliged to do these things, you have to do the rest of what the law of Moses says to be right with God. But if you're being faithful to the Master Jesus, if your obedience is to him and not the Torah, that's what you should be focusing on. Focus your obedience to King Jesus, not to the provisions of the law of Moses. That's what Paul is contrasting here in the letter to the Galatians. He's not saying you have a choice between believing the gospel is actually true or trying to believe God with your actions. And again, this is how they have redefined the word law here to mean all of your visible actions. It's not what it was. It's the law of Moses, which contained certain ways to get right with God and which have been followed for centuries by Jews who did get right with God that way. Paul is saying the law of Moses has been superseded because the Messiah came and has done the greatest of sacrifices. That's what he's saying. He's not saying you don't have to do anything except believe that Jesus actually rose. That is an absurd interpretation. A child sacrificing Satanist could believe that Jesus rose, and they're still going to be in the lake of fire with Onorato on Judgment Day.
A partial obedience is insufficient. A perfect obedience is necessary.
Wrong.
Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified. Not then, not now, not ever. Romans chapter.
Wrong. Then that was how they became just. those who were under the law actually became just every year. That was the whole purpose of the law. That was the purpose of the temple and the priesthood. Paul is simply saying that is now obsolete. It is fidelity to the Messiah, not the Torah, that justifies. This fool doesn't get it.
Chapter 4, verse 1 says, "What shall we say then that Abraham, our father, as pertaining to the flesh, hath found? For if Abraham were justified by works, he hath whereof to glory," notice this, "but not before" who? God. Repeat that after me. "But not before God. For what saith the scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness."
Believed what? Believed what? What did Abraham believe? He obviously didn't believe that prophecy about his offspring being as numerous as the stars in the sky. Well, if he did, he wouldn't have tried to pass his wife off as his sister to Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 12. And if he believed that promise about his offspring, he wouldn't have had a child by his Egyptian slave Hagar. As we read in Genesis chapter 16, him and Sarah had completely given up hope on having any children of their own. And so they used her slave Hagar to have Ishmael. So what exactly did Abraham believe? Can you tell me, Onorato? I don't think you can. You know what? Genesis chapter 26, verses 4 and 5, God tells Isaac why he's going to be blessed. And it wasn't because his father was so gullible. It was because his father obeyed God's laws and his statutes, obeyed God. That is the correct translation of Romans chapter 4 and verse 3. And I've done that. I have a fuller explanation in my video, Romans 4, arguably the New Testament's most misunderstood chapter. I can see it's going to take quite a while to debunk all of this misinformation here. And I think what I'll be doing is turning the exposure of this goddamned false prophet into a playlist. I could see 5, 10, 15 videos being made of this goddamned false teacher, exposing every one of his amok running lies, his ignorance-based, oh so convenient eisegesis of every relevant scripture. I could see this fellow becoming quite the useful teaching tool. And so rather than wear you out with a 2-hour-long video, I think I'm going to stop here. This will be the first one of quite a number to come. Now, by the way, I should add, I offered Onorato a chance to meet with me on Zoom. I haven't heard back from him, and I do not expect to hear back from him. You look on his own playlist, I couldn't find any debates that he has had with anyone. I couldn't find any guest experts that he has had on his videos. This fellow doesn't want to hear anything from anyone, but he does want you to donate, doesn't he? All right. We will deal with this fellow again and soon. Have a good night, everyone.